February 17th, 1973. The Beverly Hills mansion belonging to producer Robert Evans was filled with cigarette smoke and whispered conversations when every person in that dining room suddenly went silent. Steve McQueen, Hollywood's self-proclaimed king of cool, had just placed his hand on Clint Eastwood's shoulder. Not a friendly pat, a grip, the kind that says, "I own you." 20 of Hollywood's most powerful people watched as Steve leaned down toward the seated Clint, his champagne-fueled confidence radiating across the elegant table. The crystal chandelier cast shadows that made the moment feel threatening, and Clint Eastwood, sitting perfectly still with his jaw clenched tight, was staring down at that hand with an expression that made everyone hold their breath. What happened in the next 60 seconds would end a friendship that never existed. It would expose a rivalry that had simmered for nearly a decade, and it would lead to revenge so devastating that Steve McQueen would spend his final years watching the man he tried to destroy become everything he'd wanted to be. But nobody at that table knew any of that yet. All they knew was that something bad was about to happen. Frank Sinatra had his hand frozen halfway to his forehead. Dean Martin had stopped mid-sip. A woman in a red dress had both hands covering her mouth. Because Steve McQueen had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and Clint Eastwood was about to teach him a lesson in patience, power, and the cost of underestimating a man with nothing to lose. To understand how two of Hollywood's biggest stars ended up in this moment, you need to go back to 1964, back when both men were hungry, ambitious, and convinced they were destined for greatness. Steve McQueen was already a star. The Great Escape had made him an international sensation. He was handsome, charismatic, and absolutely certain he was the best actor in Hollywood. He drove race cars, dated beautiful women, and walked into every room like he owned it. Clint Eastwood was a television actor making $300 a week on rawhide. He was tall, quiet, and had a face carved from granite. Most people in Hollywood barely knew his name. They first met at a Warner Brothers party in spring 1964. Steve was holding court, telling stories about motorcycle racing. Clint stood near the bar nursing a beer. Someone introduced them. Steve looked Clint up and down with barely concealed amusement. "Rawhide, right? My kid watches that show." The dismissal was clear. "You're television. I'm cinema." Clint smiled politely. "It pays the bills." "I bet it does," Steve said, already turning away to talk to someone more important. That should have been the end of it. A brief meeting between a star and a nobody. But something about that dismissal stuck with Clint. The way Steve had looked through him, not at him, like he wasn't even worth acknowledging. Steve forgot about the meeting within an hour. Clint remembered it for 9 years, and that difference would determine everything that came next. 1966, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Steve McQueen was promoting the Sand Pebbles, and he was in rare form. Charming, funny, completely at ease in front of 20 million viewers. Johnny asked about the next big stars in Hollywood. Steve leaned back, that famous cocky smile playing across his face. "You know, Johnny, there's a lot of TV cowboys thinking they can transition to real films. But television is television. Movies are movies. Not everyone can make that jump." "Anyone specific?" Johnny asked, sensing blood. Steve shrugged. "There's this guy, does westerns on TV. Rawhide, I think. Clint something. Nice enough guy, but..." He made a dismissive gesture. "TV cowboy. That's probably where he'll stay." 20 million people watched Steve McQueen casually dismiss Clint Eastwood on national television. And one of those 20 million was Clint himself, sitting in his small apartment. The phone rang within minutes. His agent. "Don't worry about it. Steve's just protecting his territory." But it did mean something. 2 weeks later, Clint lost out on a major film role. The director told his agent, "We're looking for a movie star, not a TV actor." A month later, another role disappeared. Then another. And slowly, Clint began to understand something that would change his entire approach to Hollywood. Steve McQueen wasn't just dismissing him. Steve was actively working to make sure he stayed dismissed. What Clint didn't know was that Steve McQueen had made it his mission to keep TV cowboys out of serious cinema. And Clint was his primary target. Steve had influence. When he walked into a producer's office and said, "Don't hire that rawhide guy, he's not leading man material," people listened. When he told directors that Clint was just a TV actor playing dress-up. It stuck. By 1967, Clint had been passed over for 7 major roles, 7 opportunities that could have launched his film career, 7 doors that closed for reasons nobody would explain. His agent finally told him the truth. Steve McQueen is telling everyone you're not ready for features. He's got the ear of every major producer in town. Why? Clint asked, genuinely confused. Because you're tall, good-looking, and Western. You're potential competition. And Steve doesn't like competition. Clint sat there, absorbing this. He could have been angry, could have fought back, could have tried to meet with Steve and clear the air. Instead, he made a different choice. He stopped trying to break into Hollywood films, and when Italian director Sergio Leone offered him a Western to film in Spain for $15,000, Clint said yes without hesitation. It was the lowest point of his American career. His agent said it was career suicide. His friends said he was throwing away his shot at real stardom. Only Clint understood what he was really doing. He was getting out of Steve's kingdom entirely, and he was about to build his own. A Fistful of Dollars premiered in Italy in 1964 and became a sensation. The film eventually made its way to America in 1967, and suddenly everyone was talking about this mysterious Western with the quiet American actor nobody had heard of. Clint Eastwood wasn't just good in it, he was magnetic. The cigar-chomping stranger with no name, deadly with a gun, and deadlier with silence. It was everything Steve's characters pretended to be, but raw and real. The film made $14 million. Then for a few dollars more made $20 million. Then The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly made $25 million. By 1968, Clint Eastwood was an international film star, and he'd done it completely outside the Hollywood system Steve controlled. Steve saw the box office numbers. He saw the magazine covers. He saw Clint's face on billboards across Los Angeles. And for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Concern. This wasn't supposed to happen. TV cowboys stayed on television. But Clint had broken the rules by refusing to play the game Steve controlled. At a Malibu party, someone asked Steve what he thought of Clint's success. Steve smiled his famous smile. Good for him. Those spaghetti westerns are fun little movies. But everyone could hear the edge in his voice. The dismissal wasn't working anymore. Clint Eastwood was becoming somebody, and worse, he was doing it in Steve's genre. The rivalry Steve had created casually was about to become very personal. 1970 through 1972 were Steve McQueen's biggest years. Bullet, The Getaway, Le Mans. He was making $2 million per film. He was the highest paid actor in Hollywood, except he didn't have the thing he wanted most, to be the only cowboy that mattered. Because in those same years, Clint Eastwood did something unforgivable. He kept rising. Kelly's Heroes. 2 Mules for Sister Sarah, The Beguiled. And then in 1971, Clint did something that made Steve's blood run cold. He directed his first film, Play Misty for Me, and it was good. Steve had always wanted to direct, had talked about it constantly, but he'd never actually done it. Meanwhile, this TV cowboy he'd tried to blacklist had just directed a critically acclaimed thriller. Then came Dirty Harry. Released Christmas 1971, it made $36 million and turned Clint into an icon. "Do you feel lucky, punk?" became the most quoted line in cinema. Steve went to see it at a private screening, sat in the dark, watching this character that was everything his persona aspired to be. Tough, quiet, deadly, and authentic. He left the theater and told his wife, "It's a good movie," but what he was thinking was, that should have been me. The jealousy wasn't rational. Steve was more successful by every metric, but Clint had something Steve wanted. He had respect. He had versatility. He had the future. And Steve could feel his own time at the top slipping away. February 17th, 1973. Robert Evans' mansion. A dinner party celebrating nothing except the fact that these were the people who mattered. Steve arrived drunk. Not falling down drunk, but champagne-confident drunk. The kind that makes bad decisions feel brilliant. Clint arrived sober. He'd been filming Magnum Force all week and was tired. But Evans was powerful, and you didn't decline his invitations. They ended up at the same table. Clint was seated eating quietly when Steve walked up behind him. "Eastwood," Steve said loudly. "Didn't know you'd be here." Clint looked up. "Steve, good to see you." Yeah? Steve's hand came down on Clint's shoulder. Firm, possessive. You've been doing well. Those cop movies are making you money. The table went quiet. Clint didn't move. Just sat there staring down at Steve's hand. Thanks, Clint said, his voice level. You know, Steve continued, leaning down, his breath wine-soaked. I always wondered what would have happened if you'd actually made it in real Hollywood, instead of those Italian things and TV movies dressed up as features. Frank Sinatra's hand froze. Dean Martin stopped talking. A woman in red put both hands over her mouth. Everyone understood what was happening. Steve McQueen, drunk on power and champagne, had just publicly insulted Clint Eastwood at a dinner table in front of Hollywood royalty. And Clint was still sitting perfectly still, staring at that hand with an expression that made everyone nervous. Clint didn't explode, didn't stand up, didn't punch Steve. He did something more frightening. He looked up at Steve with those ice-blue eyes and spoke in a voice so quiet everyone leaned in to hear. Take your hand off my shoulder, Steve. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat. It was gravity. Steve, drunk and stupid, tried to laugh it off. Come on, Eastwood, I'm just… Take your hand off. The room held its breath. Steve's smile faltered. He suddenly realized what everyone else had figured out. Clint Eastwood wasn't scared, wasn't intimidated, wasn't playing Steve's game. Steve removed his hand, tried to save face with a casual shrug. Jesus, lighten up. Clint went back to his meal, cut a piece of steak, chewed slowly, swallowed. Then he looked up at Steve, still standing there awkwardly. You had your shot, Steve. You blocked me from every role you could, told every producer I was just a TV cowboy. And you were right, I was just a TV cowboy. He paused, took a sip of water. But I'm not anymore. And the difference between you and me? I didn't need to step on anyone to get where I am. I just worked. While you were telling people I wasn't good enough, I was proving I was. The table was silent. Steve's face had gone red. Thanks for the motivation. Every door you closed made me knock harder on the next one. I'll make sure to thank you in my acceptance speech someday. Steve walked away from that table, and he never spoke to Clint Eastwood again. What happened next wasn't dramatic. There was no public feud, no Hollywood war, just cold, calculated success. 1973 through 1980, Clint Eastwood became unstoppable. He directed and starred in High Plains Drifter, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Every Which Way But Loose, Escape from Alcatraz. And while Steve was still making movies, something had shifted. The roles got smaller. The box office got quieter. He did Papillon and The Towering Inferno. Both successful, but he wasn't the center of Hollywood's gravity anymore. Clint had become a director people respected, an actor people took seriously, and someone the industry wanted to work with. No ego, no drama, just professionalism and results. In 1977, a major producer who'd worked with both men was asked about the difference. Steve's brilliant, but exhausting. Every day is a battle. Clint, he shows up, does the work, goes home, and the work is always good. That quote made its way back to Steve. He called the producer furious. You're comparing me to a TV cowboy? The producer's response was simple. I'm comparing you to a director who's made 6 successful films. Maybe you should try it instead of talking about it. Steve tried. He directed Tom Horn in 1980. It was troubled, expensive, and barely broke even. Clint's films from the same period made $40 million combined. The revenge Clint took wasn't about confrontation. It was about becoming everything Steve wanted to be. Actor, director, icon, legend, and doing it without ever putting his hand on someone's shoulder to feel powerful. Steve McQueen died in 1980 at age 50. Cancer took him, but friends said he'd been dying slower for years. Dying from the realization that the future he'd tried to prevent was happening anyway. A week before he passed, a visitor mentioned that Clint was being considered to direct Unforgiven. Steve, weak but still proud, smiled. Good for him. But there was something else in his eyes, something like regret. Clint never spoke publicly about Steve. When asked in interviews, he always said, Steve was talented. I wish we'd gotten to work together. But people who knew both men understood. It meant Clint had won completely. He'd won so thoroughly he could afford to be gracious. Unforgiven came out in 1992. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Clint Eastwood. In his acceptance speech, Clint thanked his family, his crew, and everyone who'd believed in him. He didn't mention Steve McQueen. He didn't need to. The story of Steve and Clint isn't just about 2 actors. It's about the difference between trying to control your competition and simply outlasting them. It's about demanding respect versus earning it. It's about the cost of underestimating the quiet guy in the corner. February 17, 1973. Steve McQueen put his hand on Clint Eastwood's shoulder and tried to make him feel small. Clint removed that hand and spent the next 2 decades proving that some people can't be made small. They can only be challenged. And challenges are exactly what made Clint Eastwood a legend.